I've always thought that by the age of 72, a man deserves peace. My hands, calloused from years of construction work, are not as strong as they used to be. My back hurts in the morning and my knees creak like the unlubricated hinges of an old door. But my mind is still clear, and I remember everything, every day of my life, every decision I made, and every missed opportunity. My name is Aldrich Poundstone. I've worked all my life as a construction superintendent in Brunswick, a small town where everyone knows each other and where it's impossible to hide any secrets. I supervised the construction of half the buildings downtown, including the new library and municipal building. I built dozens of houses that house the people I meet on the streets. I was respected by my colleagues and valued by my customers. I was proud of my work and the fact that I could provide a decent life for my family. My wife Eleanor was a wonderful woman, quiet, with a soft smile and kind eyes the color of an autumn sky. We lived together for 45 years. We had an only daughter, Viola. Eleanor died 3 years ago of pancreatic cancer. The disease took her quickly, and before I even realized I was losing her, I was alone in our big house on Maple Street. It was a house we had picked out together when we were first married. It was neglected and in need of serious repairs, but I saw potential in it. I spent every weekend fixing it up, remodeling it, updating it. I built a new fireplace and a veranda overlooking a small garden where Eleanor planted roses and hydrangeas. The house became an extension of ourselves, of our history. After Eleanor died, I couldn't bring myself to move, though neighbors and a few friends hinted that the house was too big for a lonely old man. Viola visited me infrequently. After graduating from college, she moved to Portland, where she worked as an interior designer. There, she met Hubert Tinker, a thin man with sharp features and a perpetually disgruntled look. He worked for a commercial real estate construction company. Viola said he was a fast riser, but when I'd met him at their wedding 6 years ago, I hadn't seen the sparkle in his eyes that comes from a man who is truly passionate about his work. When Eleanor died, Viola flew to the funeral, stayed 3 days and flew back, citing an important project. I didn't blame her. Everyone has their own life, and I'd never been a father who demanded constant attention. We called once a week on Sundays, and that was enough. I learned to live alone, cooked myself simple meals, kept the house in order, sometimes met with former colleagues at the local bar, Frank's, to discuss the city news and reminisce about the old days. And then, quite unexpectedly, Viola called and said that she and Hubert were moving to Brunswick. Allegedly, Hubert's company was opening a branch office there, and he had been offered to head the new office. Viola spoke quickly and excitedly, and I sensed there was something else behind it, but I was too happy to see my daughter more often to ask too many questions. "We could stay with you for a while until we find a suitable home," she said, as if she were doing me a favor. "It's hard for you to live alone in a house this big, isn't it? We'll help with cleaning, cooking." I agreed without thinking. The thought of having Viola's voice in the house again drowned out all doubts. They arrived 2 weeks later, Hubert driving an impressive black SUV, Viola beside him, with a new haircut and the expression of a man who was performing an unpleasant but necessary duty. "Daddy, you've lost weight," was the first thing she said as she hugged me. She smelled of expensive perfume and something else I couldn't recognize, maybe the life she was leading away from me. Hubert shook my hand dryly and formally, looking around the house with a realtor's appraising gaze. I showed them the room I'd prepared, the former guest room on the second floor, overlooking the garden. Hubert only grinned and Viola smiled awkwardly. "We were thinking of taking the master bedroom, Dad. It's more spacious and it has its own bathroom." I froze. The master bedroom was mine and Eleanor's. Her things were still there, the perfume bottles on the dressing table, the book she hadn't finished, the glasses in their case on the bedside table. I couldn't bring myself to put those things away, as if, as long as they were there, a part of Eleanor was still with me. "Of course," I heard my voice, as if someone else was speaking. "I'll move my things into the study." That same evening, I moved into the small room that used to be my home office. I set up the cot, moved the essentials of my clothes. Viola and Hubert took Eleanor's and my bedroom, and I could hear them rearranging furniture, opening and closing drawers, throwing things away. The first few days passed in turmoil. Viola did cook, complicated dishes with names I couldn't remember and flavors I couldn't get used to. Hubert left early in the morning and returned late in the evening, always with the disgruntled look of a man who owed everything. I tried to stay out of the way, spending most of the day in the garden or in the garage where I had a small workshop. After a week, Viola told me that she had been offered a job at a local design office and would now be away all day too. And after another week, I noticed that the refrigerator was increasingly short of groceries and the house was accumulating clutter. "Daddy, could you go to the store?" Viola asked one morning, hurriedly putting on her makeup in front of the mirror in the hallway. "We need milk and eggs and something for dinner. And we're out of laundry detergent, too." I, of course, agreed. What's wrong with helping a busy daughter? But gradually, more and more of these requests came. "Daddy, would you please wash my blouses?" "Daddy, could you iron Hubert's shirts?" "Daddy, would you mind vacuuming the whole house today?" I didn't mind. I had nothing better to do, and I was happy to be helpful. But something changed in the tone of these requests. They sounded more and more like orders, and gratitude sounded less and less frequent. One evening, when the three of us were having dinner, a rare occasion when Hubert got home on time, I dared to ask how the search for a place of my own was going. Hubert and Viola exchanged quick glances. "You know, Papa," Viola began, twirling a strand of hair around her finger, a gesture she used to do when she was nervous, "we thought it might make sense to stay here." "Here?" I questioned, feeling something cold clench in my chest. "It's a big house," she continued, avoiding my gaze. "You don't need it alone. And we could help with the bills, the repairs." "Repairs?" I looked around the dining room where every detail had been done by me. "The house is in excellent condition." "Well, that's what you think," Hubert interjected, cutting off a piece of meat as if it were a personal insult. "The roof needs replacing, the wiring is outdated, not to mention the plumbing. This wreck is barely hanging on." I felt myself blush with anger and resentment. "This house will be here 100 years after you rot in the ground, boy," I said quietly. Viola gasped. "Daddy, how can you say that? Hubert is just concerned for your safety. You're an elderly man, so anything can happen." "I'm 72. Not 92, I replied, "and I'm perfectly fine." But they weren't listening. Hubert was saying something about the market value of the property in the neighborhood, about how stupid it was to keep such an asset idle, about how, with the money I had, I could move into a full-service nursing home. "A nursing home?" I interjected, not believing my ears. "You want to send me to a nursing home?" "Not now, of course," Viola hurried to assure me. "But we have to think about the future. Your future, Dad." After that dinner, something broke. I began to notice Hubert looking around the rooms, making notes on his phone, discussing remodeling with Viola as if I were no longer there. They were talking about how they would convert my office into a nursery, even though they didn't have children and Viola had never mentioned plans for a baby. Hubert talked about tearing down the wall between the living room and dining room to make a modern open space. I also began to notice how they talked about me, not to me, but specifically about me, as if I were not a person but a piece of furniture. "Your father left the dirty cup in the sink again. He turns the TV on too loud. Have you seen him watering the roses? They'll rot." Gradually, I was removed from making any decisions in the house. Viola stopped asking me what I wanted for dinner. Now she only cooked what Hubert liked. Hubert reprogrammed the thermostat to make the house cooler. He loved the cold, and I had been cold all my life and preferred to keep the temperature up. They started inviting guests, their co-workers, and new friends without telling me. I only found out about an upcoming dinner or party when Viola gave me a list of groceries to buy or asked me to prepare the guest room. "Daddy, would you mind having dinner at your place tonight?" Viola asked one evening. "We're going to have guests from Hubert's company, important people. We'd like to make a good impression." I nodded, swallowing resentment. This was my home, but now I was eating alone in my small room, listening to the clinking of glasses and the laughter of strangers downstairs. Every day I turned more and more into a servant. Laundry, cleaning, cooking, shopping. Everything fell on my shoulders. Viola didn't ask anymore. She left to-do lists on the kitchen table before she went to work. Hubert didn't talk to me at all, just gave me orders without making eye contact. Shirts should be ready by 6, and don't forget the arrows on the pants. I did everything in silence, angry at myself for letting it happen, but unable to change the situation. This was my daughter, my only family. I was afraid I would lose her if I objected. The tension in the house was growing by the day. I could see Hubert and Viola whispering, silent when I entered the room. I could hear them arguing at night, muffled voices coming through the walls. Viola cried often. One day, I noticed a bruise on her wrist, but when I asked, she waved it away. "I hit the door jamb, Daddy. Don't worry about it." I didn't believe it, but I didn't insist. Something told me that their move to Brunswick wasn't about Hubert's career advancement, but about something else. Perhaps it was financial. I'd noticed Viola checking prices at the store, refusing to buy things she would have put in her shopping cart without a second thought. Hubert started coming home more often during the day, talking about working from home, but I never once saw him actually working. He sat in the living room with a glass of whiskey, staring into the space in front of him, or wandered aimlessly around the house, touching things as if estimating their value. The day everything changed, it was raining. I was coming back from the store, soaking wet. My old umbrella had broken halfway through, and I hadn't bought a new one, saving money from my modest pension. Hubert was home, pacing the living room with his cell phone in his hand. He was talking loudly, not noticing me. "No, it won't work that way. I need this deal. You don't understand, I can't—" He noticed me and cut me off abruptly. "I'll call you back." I walked into the kitchen, leaving wet footprints on the floor which I had mopped myself that morning. I was about to go upstairs to change into dry clothes when Hubert appeared in the doorway. "Can't you see what you've done?" He pointed to the marks on the floor. "I'm sorry," I said tiredly. "I'll wipe it up." "Damn old man," he muttered. "You're more trouble than you're worth." I stayed silent, pulling a floor cloth from under the sink. My back ached, my knees ached, and there was a heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. "Give it to me!" Hubert suddenly snatched the rag from me, his face contorted with anger. "Is this how you mop the floor?" He threw the wet rag in my face. Dirty water ran down my cheeks, dripping onto my shirt collar. I stood still, feeling the cold droplets roll down my neck, sending an unpleasant shiver down my spine, not from the cold, but from the humiliation. "Wipe yourself, servant." Hubert's voice rang with anger. "That's what you're here for, to clean up after us. You're no good for anything else, you old git." I raised my hand slowly and wiped my face with the back of my hand. My eyes darkened for a moment, not from weakness, but from a rage that was rising from somewhere deep, from a place I'd long since forgotten existed. For 40 years I had managed construction crews, resolving conflicts between workers, building relationships with suppliers and customers. And now I stood in my own kitchen, humiliated by a man who didn't deserve even a tiny fraction of my respect. "Hubert," I said quietly, "you've crossed the line." He laughed in my face, and it was worse than an insult. "What line, old man? You're living in my house, eating my food." "This is my house," I interrupted him, feeling my hands shaking. "Every nail, every board in it was made by my hands, and I won't let you." At that moment Viola entered the kitchen. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless, but her eyes betrayed fatigue and something else, fear, worry, anxiety. She looked around the kitchen, her gaze lingering on the wet footprints on the floor, on my wet face, on Hubert's angry face. "What's going on here?" she asked in the tone she'd used as a child, trying to sound more mature than she really was. "Your father," Hubert began, but I didn't let him finish. "Your husband threw a rag in my face," I said, looking straight into my daughter's eyes. "Called me a servant. In my own house. I waited for her reaction, outrage, defense, some show of daughterly love. But Viola only sighed tiredly, as if it were just another nuisance in a series of minor domestic problems. "Papa, did you make Hubert angry again?" She spoke as if she were reprimanding a naughty child. "You know he's going through a rough patch at work. He needs to pay attention." Something inside of me snapped. I lost my daughter a lot sooner than that. Maybe when I let her and her husband cross my threshold with those fake smiles and false promises of care. Or even earlier, when, after Eleanor's death, I couldn't find the strength to keep in touch with the only person I'd ever known. "I'll mop the floor," I said quietly, picking up a rag from the floor. "And then we need to talk." Viola and Hubert looked at each other. There was no remorse in their looks, just annoyance and something else I couldn't read. They turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with a dirty rag in my hands and a heaviness in my chest. I slowly knelt down and began wiping the floor. My joints protested against this position, but the physical pain was almost a pleasant distraction from the mental pain. I rubbed and rubbed those damned marks, as if I could erase with them the humiliation I'd suffered. When I was done, I stood up, writhing against the pain in my knees, and leaned against the kitchen table. Outside the window, it was beginning to be a spring evening, the soft golden light coloring the treetops, the light breeze ruffling the curtains. How out of sync with what was going on in my soul. I looked at my hands, knotted with protruding veins covered with age spots, but still strong, hands that held a hammer and saw, kneaded cement, turned nuts, lifted beams, hands that hugged Eleanor and little Viola. Those hands could still do something, make a difference. I went quietly up to my room, a former study turned into a cramped shelter. There weren't many things in there. An old dresser, a narrow bed, a bookshelf with tattered tomes on construction, and a couple of detectives I'd been rereading lately. The only picture on the wall was of Eleanor and me on the front porch of this house, young, happy, hopeful. I sat on the edge of the bed and covered my face with my hands. How could I have let things get this far? When had I stopped being a master in my own home and turned into a wordless servant? When did I let my daughter and her husband treat me like a burden, like a problem to be solved? Memories came flooding back to me, Viola as a child, with pigtails and freckles on her nose, asking for help with her homemade birdhouse. Viola as a teenager, arguing with me about curfew. Viola in her prom dress, so beautiful and so alien. Viola in her wedding dress next to Hubert, whom I disliked at first sight but kept silent because a daughter should choose her own path. Maybe that was my mistake. That I always backed down, always let her do her own thing even when I saw that it was a path to nowhere. Since Eleanor's death, I had become a shadow of myself, a gutless old man who feared loneliness more than humiliation. I didn't notice it was getting dark. There were voices downstairs. Viola and Hubert were arguing, but I couldn't make out the words. I did not go down to supper. I had neither the strength nor the desire to see their faces again. At night I hardly slept at all. I tossed and turned in my narrow bed, listening to the creaks of the old house, to the rustles outside the window, to my own thoughts that swirled in my head like autumn leaves in the wind. By morning, I had made a decision. I would no longer be silent. I would regain control of my life, of my home. I didn't know exactly how, but I was determined that the change would begin today. The morning was clear and cool. I went down to the kitchen earlier than usual so that I could drink my coffee alone and collect my thoughts before the inevitable conversation. But Hubert was already in the kitchen, in his expensive robe with a cup of coffee, staring at his laptop screen. He didn't even look up when I walked in. I silently poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. Hubert continued to ignore me, frowning, staring at the screen. His fingers nervously drummed a rhythm on the countertop. Something was wrong. Usually in the morning he was already dressed and ready to go to the office, and he'd never looked so troubled. "Problems at work?" I asked, partly out of politeness, partly to break the awkward silence. Hubert looked up as if he'd just noticed me. "None of your business, old man," he snapped. "You'd better get on with your breakfast. Viola will be down soon." I felt the rage of yesterday rising inside me again, but I held it back. This wasn't the time for confrontation. "Of course," I replied with fake resignation, and stood up to get the pan. Hubert's cell phone rang at that moment. He flinched, glanced at the screen, and cursing walked out of the kitchen into the hallway, closing the door tightly behind him. But the house was old, the walls thin, and Hubert's voice, though muffled, was clearly audible. "Yes, Lance, I got your message." "No, it's impossible. We can't drop the price any lower. It's ridiculous." I pretended to be busy making scrambled eggs, but I was actually listening intensely to the conversation. "Look," Hubert's voice sounded almost pleading, "the company is worth a lot more. Projects in development, contracts. Yes, I know about those rumors, but they're exaggerated." Pause. I broke the eggs into a bowl, trying not to make any noise. "Okay," Hubert continued, and there was desperation in his voice. "I can come today. At 2? Yes, I'll be there. And Lance, this has to stay between us. If the board finds out I'm looking for a buyer behind their backs." Another pause, followed by the sound of a dropped phone and a muffled curse. I quickly turned my back to the stove as the door opened and Hubert came back into the kitchen. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "I have to leave," he said without looking at me. "Tell Viola I'll be back late." He left without waiting for an answer. A few minutes later, I heard the front door slam. Then the engine of his SUV rumbled. I was alone in the kitchen, mechanically stirring my scrambled eggs and thinking about what I'd heard. Hubert seems to be having serious business problems. Is he trying to sell the company, or part of it? And he's doing it secretly, behind the board's back? That would explain his nervousness these past weeks, the sudden absences, the constant whispered phone calls. Viola came down 15 minutes later, already dressed for work with her purse over her shoulder. "Good morning, Daddy," she said as she entered the kitchen. Her voice sounded strained. "Where's Hubert?" "He's away on business," I answered without turning around. "He said he'd be back late." Viola sighed and sat down at the table. I put a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her and poured fresh coffee. We ate in silence, avoiding looking at each other. I felt like I should start talking about last night's incident, but I didn't know where to begin. "Viola," I finally said, pulling myself together, "we need to talk about what happened yesterday." She looked up, tired, with dark circles that even perfect makeup couldn't hide. "Daddy, let's not do this right now, okay? I have an important meeting today. I'm late." "No," I said firmly. "Not now. I can't take it anymore, Viola. The way Hubert treats me in my own home. The way you let him do it." Viola put down her fork and leaned back in her chair. "What do you want me to say, Papa? An apology? Well, I apologize for Hubert. He can be, abrupt. But you have to understand, he's going through a very difficult time." "I don't want an apology," I interrupted. "I want respect. I want you to stop treating me like a servant. I want to know what's really going on, Viola. Why did you move to Brunswick? What happened in Portland?" Viola turned pale and averted her eyes. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice trembled. "Hubert has been offered a position here. I told you. Stop lying." I didn't raise my voice, but There was a steely note in it that I hadn't heard myself say in a long time. I know Hubert's in trouble with the company. He's trying to sell it, isn't he? And he's doing it in secret. What's wrong, Viola? Did he do something? Viola jumped up, knocking over her coffee cup. The dark liquid spread across the table, dripping onto the floor. Were you eavesdropping? Spying on him? She was furious, but behind that fury I saw fear. How dare you? I was not spying, I answered calmly. Hubert spoke loudly enough. And don't change the subject, Viola. I have a right to know what's going on in my house. Viola raked her purse and keys from the table. You don't understand anything, Papa. You live in your own little world thinking only of your own comfort, your own grievances. We have real problems. What problems, Viola? I stood up, looking her straight in the eye. Tell me. I'm your father. I can help. She laughed bitterly. Help? What can you do, Dad? Your measly pension. Stories about building houses 50 years ago? Hubert's right. You're good for nothing but mopping floors and making breakfast. Her words hit me harder than the rag Hubert threw. I felt something tearing inside me, the last thread that bound me to the daughter I had once known and loved. I understand, I said quietly. I understand now, Viola. Thank you for your honesty. She froze for a moment as if she'd just realized what she'd said. Something flashed across her face. Remorse? Regret? But it was quickly replaced by a mask of cold indifference. I have to go to work, she said, heading for the door. And don't tell Hubert what you overheard. You're making things worse. She left, leaving me alone in the kitchen with spilled coffee and a broken heart. I sank slowly into a chair, feeling my strength leave me. All my life I'd tried to be a good father, working hard, providing for my family, being there for them when they needed me. And this was how it ended. Scorn and humiliation from the only person I'd lived for since Eleanor's death. I sat there for so long, not moving, not thinking, just letting the pain flow through me like a river through rocks. Then I got up, wiped up the spilled coffee, washed the dishes. The mechanical acts helped me gather my thoughts. By noon, I had made a decision. No more being a victim, no more letting my dignity be trampled. I'm going to take back control of my life, and I'm going to start right now. I don't know how yet, but I'm not going to take any more humiliation in my own home. Maybe overhearing Hubert's conversation will give me a clue. If he's having business difficulties, if he's secretly trying to sell the company, there might be an opportunity for me. I went up to my room and pulled a metal box of important documents and bank statements from under my bed. After Eleanor died, I was left with a good amount of money from the sale of our share of the family business. I'd always been frugal, and that money was lying around untouched for a rainy day. I think that day has come. Perhaps Hubert's business is the key to restoring my dignity. I need to find out more about Tinker Construction and what's going on there. Maybe my experience in the construction industry will come in handy, and maybe I can turn this situation from humiliating to profitable for me. For the first time in a long time, I felt a surge of energy and determination. I didn't know exactly how, but I was going to change my life, regain my respect, and show Hubert that the old dog could still bite. After that conversation with Viola, I spent a few days thinking about the situation. I couldn't get Hubert's overheard phone call out of my head. A company on the verge of bankruptcy, secret negotiations for a sale, fear of the board of directors, all of it pointed to serious problems in my son-in-law's business, and perhaps an opportunity for me. I started cautiously. The first thing I decided to do was to test the validity of the information I had overheard by chance. One morning, after Viola and Hubert had left for work, I sat down at the computer in the living room. 15 years ago, when the internet was just entering our lives, Eleanor had insisted that I learn how to use it. "Don't be a dinosaur, Aldrich," she'd said, pushing me toward the monitor. I resisted, but she was persistent, and now I was grateful to her for it. I typed Tinker Construction Portland Problems into the search box. It didn't take long for the results to come up. Several articles in local business publications mentioned Hubert's company in a negative way. Tinker Construction blows off office center construction deadline. Investors express concern about Tinker Construction's financial situation and possible lawsuit against construction company for breach of contract. The articles were dated within the last 6 months, just before their sudden move to Brunswick. The next query was Hubert Tinker business biography. There wasn't much information, but enough to form a picture. Hubert had inherited the company from his father 5 years ago. Prior to that, he had worked for it in a management position, but apparently had no real experience managing construction projects. His education is a bachelor's degree in business administration, no technical background. In one interview, he proudly proclaimed plans to expand the business, enter new markets, and double turnover in 3 years. I hummed reading this. Ambition without a real understanding of the industry is a recipe for disaster. The construction business does not tolerate amateurs. It's not enough to understand finance and marketing. You need to understand how construction works, what pitfalls can be encountered, how to manage crews, and how to estimate realistic timescales and costs. Apparently, Hubert didn't understand this. Further searching led me to a builders forum where they were discussing payment problems with Tinker construction contractors. Some complained about late payments. Others mentioned substandard materials that the company was trying to use to save money. They take on projects they can't pull off and then try to get by at the contractor's expense, one user wrote. All indications were that the company was indeed in deep crisis, but I needed more accurate and up-to-date information. The internet is good for the big picture, but it won't give me details about the current state of affairs. For that, you need people in the industry. I pulled out my old address book, shabby with faded entries but still containing contacts accumulated over decades of working in construction. Many of the numbers were probably no longer valid. People had changed jobs, retired, or gone forever. But some connections I kept in touch with. First on my list was Frank Abbott, an old friend and colleague of mine with whom we started our careers at the same construction company. Unlike me, Frank didn't stay a foreman. He went into management, then started his own construction supply business, which eventually grew into a large company with branches all over the state. We hadn't seen each other for several years, but occasionally called on holidays. I dialed his number, mentally preparing myself for the possibility that he might not answer or remember me. But after the third ring, I heard a familiar husky voice. Abbott here. Frank? It's Aldrich Poundstone. A pause, then a surprised exclamation. Aldrich? Damn old fox, it's been a long time. How are you, buddy? Frank's voice sounded just as I remembered it, loud with a characteristic chuckle at the end of phrases. It brought back memories of our younger years, when we worked together on construction sites, shared lunches, argued about the best ways to pour foundations, and drank at Mike's bar on Fridays. Alive and well, as you can see, I replied, feeling a smile involuntarily appear on my face. I decided to call an old friend. It's been a long time since we talked. It had been a long time. Since Eleanor's funeral, I think. There's a note of sadness in Frank's voice. I'm sorry I don't call much. Things, grandchildren, you know. Of course I understand. I wasn't much better at keeping in touch myself. How's business? Oh, it's been slow. My son runs most of it now. I just advise him sometimes. I'm going to retire next year. I'm sick of it. How about you? Still in the same house? Yeah, still there. Only now I'm not alone. My daughter and her husband moved in with me recently. Oh, that's good, Frank said approvingly. It must have been hard to be alone. I hesitated, not knowing whether to get right to the point or to make small talk. But Frank was always perceptive. Okay, Aldrich, I've known you for 30 years. You didn't just call for a chat. What's up? I breathed a sigh of relief that Frank had saved me the trouble of going around the bend. You're right, Frank. I need information. about a construction company called Tinker Construction. You ever heard of it? There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Frank asked cautiously, "Why do you want to know?" "My daughter's husband is Hubert Tinker, the owner of this company." "Oh," Frank said, and I heard a strange intonation in his voice. "And what exactly are you interested in?" "Everything," I answered honestly. "Financial situation, reputation in the market, projects, problems. I have reason to believe that not everything is as smooth as they try to show." Frank whistled quietly. "You surprise me, friend. I never thought you were interested in corporate intrigue." "Life has made me do it," I replied briefly, not going into details about our family situation. "Okay," Frank said firmly. "Let's meet. You don't discuss these things over the phone. I'm just outside Brunswick right now, inspecting our branch. I can stop by this afternoon. Would 4 o'clock be okay with you?" I did a quick calculation. Viola was usually back after 6, Hubert even later. That should give us plenty of time to talk. "Perfect. I'll be waiting," I dictated the address, though Frank had visited Eleanor and me a few times years ago. I remember your house," he grinned. "The one with the veranda, the one you spent weeks building yourself, refusing any help." "I was stubborn," I admitted with a smile. "You were and you still are, Aldrich. I'll see you later." I hung up the phone, feeling strangely excited. Something was beginning, some movement after years of stagnation, and perhaps for the first time in a long time I felt I was in control. Frank arrived exactly at the appointed time. His massive figure, dressed in an expensive suit, seemed alien in my modest living room. But as soon as we sat down at the table with cups of coffee, the years seemed to melt away, and we were once again the young men who once dreamed together of a future in the construction business. After a brief exchange of news, health, children, and grandchildren, we got down to business. Frank leaned back in his chair and looked at me intently. "So, Tinker Construction," he began. "Not a good topic of conversation, Aldrich. The company's on the verge of collapse." I nodded, though my insides clenched. It was one thing to suspect and quite another to hear confirmation from someone who knew the market inside out. "How bad is it?" Frank sighed. "It couldn't be worse. The company had been quite successful under Tinker Sr. Medium-sized business, stable projects, good reputation. But when the reins passed to his son," he shook his head, "young Tinker decided to play big, took out loans, started taking over projects he couldn't handle, hired cheap contractors, skimped on materials, promised unrealistic deadlines to customers. And it all went down the drain," I said for him. "Exactly. First there were quality problems, then deadlines, then lawsuits. In the last year, Tinker Construction has lost almost every major client. Now they have huge debts, several unfinished projects that are hanging dead weight, and a team of employees who are scattering like rats from a sinking ship." I rubbed my chin thoughtfully. "Hubert is trying to sell the company?" Frank raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Where did you—" "Never mind, though. Yeah, rumor has it he's looking for a buyer. Urgently, and at a price far below the real value of the company's assets. The problem is, no one wants to deal with that kind of trouble. Plus, according to my sources, he's bypassing the board of directors. If they find out he's negotiating a sale behind their backs." "That's a breach of corporate ethics," I said. "That's putting it mildly," Frank chuckled. "It could end up in court and Tinker's personal liability for the company's debts. But apparently, he's so desperate that he's willing to take the risk." I considered what I had heard. The situation was worse than I'd realized. It explained a lot of things: Hubert's nervousness, the sudden move, their desire to stay in my house for a long time. They were broke, fleeing financial ruin. "What's the approximate value of the company now?" I asked. "If there was a buyer?" Frank said the amount, and I whistled. Even at a discount because of the company's problems, the price was significant. "Don't tell me you're thinking of buying it." Frank looked at me in disbelief. Aldrich, this is crazy. The company's in a deep hole, and it's almost impossible to get it out. And if we don't, I said slowly, formulating a thought that was just beginning to take shape in my head. What if I just get control? Frank hesitated, drumming his fingers on the table. You don't need the whole company, he said finally. A controlling interest would be enough. According to my information, Hubert Tinker owns 60% of the stock, and the rest is distributed among small shareholders and board members. If you can buy at least 35 to 40%, that would be enough to have a significant influence on decision-making. Especially if you act in alliance with the board of directors, I added, realizing where he was going with this. Exactly, Frank smiled, the familiar gambling glint in his eyes. But why would you do that, Aldrich? What's the point of it? You want to invest in a troubled business at your age? I didn't tell him about the rag thrown in my face, about Viola's words, about the daily humiliation I endured in my own home. Instead, I just said, I have my reasons, Frank. Let's just say it's personal. Frank looked at me carefully, then nodded slowly. I understand. I'll mind my own business. But if you're serious, he thought for a moment, I can help. I have connections in the banking sector. I know a couple of investors who might be interested. I can't promise it'll work, but it's worth a shot. Thank you, Frank, I said sincerely. It means a lot to me. He waved his hand. Oh, come on. We're old friends. Besides, I was wondering what you were up to. He looked at his watch. I gotta go, but I'll contact the right people. Get the details on Tinker Construction's financial situation, the options. Give me a couple days. We shook hands and Frank left. I sat at the kitchen table thinking about the information and calculating my options. I had some savings, the result of selling our share of the small family business after Eleanor's death. Not millions, of course, but a substantial sum for a man who'd lived frugally all his life and saved for the future. Plus the house. It could be used as collateral for a loan if necessary. But even all this would not be enough to buy a controlling stake in Tinker Construction. I needed partners, investors willing to take a risk with me. And I needed a strategy, not just to buy the stock, but to do it in such a way that Hubert wouldn't find out who was behind it until the very last moment. The next day, Frank called with the news. The situation is even more interesting than I thought, he said without preamble. Hubert Tinker is negotiating with the Jennings Capital Investment Group. They're offering him a ridiculous sum for his stake in the company, practically bankruptcy, but with the possibility of getting out without being personally liable for the debts. What about the board of directors? I asked. Out of the loop, as I suspected. Tinker operates in secret from them. But, Frank paused for dramatic effect, I've talked to a couple of board members through mutual acquaintances. They are extremely unhappy with Hubert, believe he has ruined the company with his unprofessionalism. If an alternative buyer comes along who will offer an adequate price and present a plan to get the company out of the crisis, they might support such a deal. I felt my pulse quicken. It was a chance. What are you suggesting? Create an investment consortium, Frank answered without hesitation. I'm ready to invest, and I have a couple of friends who could join, plus a bank loan against your house and other assets. We could outbid Jennings Capital and acquire Hubert's stake, and then, with the board's support, restructure the company. And who would be in charge? I asked doubtfully. I'm 72, Frank. I'm not going back to active duty. Don't worry about that, Frank grinned. I've got a great crisis manager in mind. A young but experienced guy who specializes in getting construction companies out of difficult situations. He'll be the COO, and we'll be the shareholders who make the strategic decisions. The plan was beginning to take shape, but the key question remained. How do I make sure Hubert doesn't find out I'm behind this? Frank thought for a moment. You could use a shell company. Create an investment firm with a neutral name, through which all negotiations and transactions would take place. Hubert will think he's selling his stake to anonymous investors, not to you personally. and only when the deal is finalized. He'll know who his new boss is, Frank finished, with a smile that reminded me of our younger years when we planned particularly complex construction projects. The next days passed in feverish activity. I met with bankers, lawyers, potential investors, always away from home, in Frank's offices or in neutral locations so as not to arouse the suspicions of Viola and Hubert. An investment company, Brunswick Ventures, was set up, with Frank as the formal director and me as the hidden principal investor. We put together an offer, slightly higher than Jennings Capital but still favorable to us, given the real value of the company's assets. Frank, through proxies, held preliminary talks with members of Tinker Construction's board of directors, gaining their support. They were prepared to block the Jennings Capital deal and support ours if Hubert did decide to bring the matter to the board. But the main bet was that Hubert, cornered by financial problems and fear of possible legal repercussions, would agree to our deal without attracting the attention of the board. He wanted to get rid of his sinking business quickly and quietly, and we were giving him that opportunity. The bank approved a loan against my house and savings. Frank and 3 other investors he brought in contributed their shares. The money was deposited into the Brunswick Ventures account and we were ready to make a formal offer. The evening before the crucial day when our offer was to be sent to Hubert, I sat in my small room looking at Eleanor's picture. What would she say about my plan? Would she approve or think it too risky? I don't know, but I felt I was making the right choice. It wasn't just about avenging Hubert's humiliation. It was about self-respect, about regaining control of my life, and perhaps a chance to save the company that Hubert's father had founded and that Hubert himself had brought to the brink. The morning began with a phone call. I had just had time to pour myself my first cup of coffee when the shrill sound of an old telephone rang out. Viola and Hubert had already left for work and the house was quiet. "Aldrich, it's Frank. Ready for the big day?" My friend's voice sounded cheerful, with a note of excitement I hadn't heard in years. The enthusiasm was contagious. "Ready as I've ever been," I replied, surprised at my own determination. "Good. I just talked to our lawyer. All the documents are ready. The money is in the accounts. All that's left is to send a formal proposal to Tinker and wait for his reaction." I took a sip of coffee, feeling my pulse quicken. Decades of work had taught me to keep my cool in stressful situations, but now I was as nervous as a young man on a first date. "Do you think he'll go for it?" Frank hummed. "Almost certain. According to my sources, Jennings Capital lowered their offer at the last minute, citing additional risks, and Tinker's on a deadline, with creditors closing in. Our offer now looks like a lifeline for a drowning man. After a short discussion of the details, we agreed to meet at the office of the law firm Morrison and Partners at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. All the members of our small consortium were to be there to officially confirm the terms of the deal and sign the necessary documents. I hung up the phone and looked out the window. The spring sun was flooding the garden with golden light, and the apple trees were swelling with buds, promising blossoms. The world seemed to approve of my decision, offering a new beginning. Before I left the house, I opened the metal safe hidden in the wall closet of my small room. The most important documents were kept there: Eleanor's marriage certificate, her death certificate, my passport, insurance policies, and bank statements. After selling our share of the family stair and railing business, I had a decent amount of money left over. I put most of it on deposit, as Eleanor had advised, for a rainy day. The money had been lying untouched for several years, gradually growing with interest. Now it was time to use it. I pulled out the last statement, scrutinized the amount. Together with the loan the bank had approved against the house, it should have been enough for my share of the deal. Frank and the other investors he'd brought in would contribute the rest. The Morrison and Associates office was in a modern glass and concrete building in the business district of Brunswick. I was a little nervous entering the cool lobby. I hadn't been in a place like this in a long time. My work clothes for most of my life consisted of jeans, a flannel shirt, and heavy boots. Today I wore the only suit I'd bought for Eleanor's funeral. Dark blue, a little baggy, but presentable enough. The secretary ushered me into the spacious meeting room, where the rest of the meeting was already assembled. Frank, in an expensive needlepoint suit, was chatting animatedly with a thin man with glasses, our lawyer, Jeffrey Morrison. In the corner sat three other men of varying ages, the investors Frank had attracted. "There's our main investor," Frank exclaimed when he saw me. "Meet Aldrich Poundstone, a legend in the Brunswick construction business." I shook the outstretched hands in embarrassment, feeling a little out of place among these men in expensive suits with confident manners. But they treated me with respect, especially when Frank spoke briefly about my experience in construction. "Mr. Poundstone," Morrison said to me, "all the documents have been prepared as we agreed. You are contributing 30% of the total deal, and the rest will be split among the other investors. Officially, the buyer is Brunswick Ventures, in which you are the largest shareholder, but you don't appear in the public records." I nodded. It was the structure of the deal that kept me anonymous until the right time. "What about the board of directors of Tinker Construction?" I asked. "Would they support our deal?" "We've had preliminary talks," replied one of the investors, who introduced himself as Daniel Brooks. "Most of the board members are in favor of the ownership change. They realize that Hubert Tinker has brought the company to a dead end. The only condition is that the key employees keep their jobs and continue their current projects." "That's reasonable," I agreed. "We're not planning layoffs or radical changes at first. First, we need to stabilize the situation, deal with debts, regain the trust of clients and contractors." Everyone nodded and we went over the details. Morrison laid out the multi-page contracts on the table, explaining each clause. I listened intently, asking questions, making revisions. Decades of working as a foreman had taught me to read contracts and spot the pitfalls. After 2 hours of discussion and adjustments, the documents were ready to be signed. I took out my checkbook and wrote a check for an amount that seemed astronomical to me yesterday. Now, I felt a strange calmness, as if this money had always been intended for this very purpose. "Congratulations, Mr. Poundstone," Morrison said, accepting the check. "You have just taken the first step toward acquiring a controlling interest in Tinker Construction." "The first, but not the last," I said. "We still have to get Hubert's approval." "Oh, I'll take care of that," Frank smiled. "I'll send him a formal proposal today on behalf of Brunswick Ventures. We'll see how quickly he responds." It turned out to be very quick. The very next day, Frank called me with the news. Tinker had taken the bait, he excitedly announced. His lawyer had contacted Morrison and said they were interested in principle in the offer, but wanted to discuss some details. That's standard wording for, "Yes, we're in, but we'll try to negotiate better terms." "What's next?" I asked, feeling my heart start to beat faster. Morrison had set up a meeting for tomorrow at 11 in the morning at their office. Tinker's lawyers will be there, possibly himself. We'll have Morrison, myself, and a couple other investors. You'd better not show your face so you don't spook the game. I agreed, though part of me longed to see Hubert's face when he realized he'd walked into a trap. But the time for that hadn't come yet. The waiting was excruciating. I couldn't find a place to be, wandering aimlessly around the house trying to read but unable to concentrate. Viola and Hubert, returning from work, didn't notice my condition. They were too busy with their own problems. Hubert looked tense, often answering the phone, going into the other room. Viola cast anxious glances at him, but did not ask questions in my presence. Finally, toward evening the next day, the long-awaited call came. "We have a deal," Frank announced triumphantly. "Tinker has agreed to all our terms. He is desperate for money and wants to close the deal as soon as possible." "What did he look like?" I couldn't resist asking. Like a man who had just avoided bankruptcy, Frank grinned, relieved but wary. He'd asked several times who was behind Brunswick Ventures, but Morrison had evasively replied that it was a group of local investors interested in growing the construction business in the region. Technically, that's true. When's the signing? The day after tomorrow, 10 a.m. All the documents are already being prepared. Once it's signed, the money will be transferred to Tinker's account and the deal will be closed. You'll officially become the largest shareholder in Tinker Construction. And when he finds out who his new boss is? That was the key moment for me. Frank was silent for a moment, pondering the answer. There are options. You can tell him as soon as he signs. You could wait a few days until the money was transferred and the deal was fully finalized. Or we could make a dramatic disclosure at the first board meeting with the new shareholders, which was scheduled for next week. I pondered which option to choose. Part of me wanted the immediate gratification of seeing the shock on Hubert's face when he realized he'd sold the company to a man he thought was a worthless old man. But the other part, the more rational part, realized it was better to wait until the deal was fully finalized. Let's wait until after the board meeting, I decided. Let the money be transferred first and the documents be finalized. I don't want to risk the deal because of personal emotions. That's a wise decision, Frank approved. I thought you'd choose this option. It's not for nothing that you and I spent so many years building houses. We learned patience. I spent the day signing the papers on pins and needles. Frank promised to call me as soon as the ceremony was over, but the time dragged agonizingly slow. I tried to do the usual things. I made breakfast for Viola and Hubert, cleaned the house, trimmed the hedges in the garden, but my thoughts kept returning to what was happening at the law firm's office. Finally, around noon, the bell rang. "It's all signed," Frank announced without preamble. Tinker had put his signature on all the documents. The money would be transferred within 24 hours and the deal would be officially closed. I closed my eyes, reliving the moment of triumph. It had happened. I, Aldrich Poundstone, the man Hubert thought was only fit to mop floors, was his boss. How was he behaving? I asked, picturing Hubert's smug face as he signed the papers. Nervous, but he tried not to show it, Frank answered. I reread the contract several times, asking questions of the lawyers, but when it came to signing, he didn't hesitate for a second. You can see that he really needs the money. What about his position in the company? According to the terms of the contract, he will remain general director for another 3 months, a transitional period. Then the board of directors will decide whether to extend his contract or not. Given that we now control the board, Frank was meaningfully silent. I understand. I nodded, though I couldn't see him. Then I have 3 months to decide his fate. Exactly. In the meantime, he has no idea who his new boss is. The board meeting with the new shareholders is scheduled for next Thursday. That's where we'll lay our cards on the table. The next few days passed in a strange state of suspense. I continued to play the role of the dutiful father-in-law, doing the household chores Viola and Hubert had assigned me. But inwardly, I felt a change. The humiliating demands were no longer bitter. Now I saw them as the last manifestations of the power Hubert would soon lose. It was like watching a play in progress, knowing an ending that was unknown to the actors. Hubert became noticeably cheerful after signing the deal. He came home with a bottle of expensive whiskey and proposed a toast to new opportunities. Viola was surprised by his sudden optimism, but didn't ask questions in front of me. I silently raised my glass, thinking about how quickly my son-in-law's mood would change when he learned the truth. The day before the board meeting, I met with Frank and the rest of the investors to discuss strategy. We gathered in the conference room of the Regency Hotel, away from prying eyes. "So, tomorrow's the big day," Frank began as everyone settled around the table. "Hubert Tinker will finally find out who his new boss is. But before we get to the personal stuff, let's talk about the company's strategy. The next 2 hours were devoted to business issues, how to stabilize the financial situation of Tinker Construction, which projects to continue and which to freeze, how to restructure debts, how to regain the trust of clients and contractors. I listened attentively and made suggestions based on my many years of experience in construction. Despite my age, I still had a good understanding of the industry. I knew its pitfalls and opportunities. Now, on a personal note, Frank said when the business part was over, how exactly are we going to let Tinker know who has become the company's largest shareholder? All eyes turned to me. I had already given it a lot of thought and had come to a definite decision. Without any unnecessary drama, I said. At the beginning of the meeting, Frank will introduce all the new shareholders, including me. Let Hubert realize the situation. I'm not going to make a scene or publicly humiliate him the way he humiliated me. It will be enough to see the look on his face when he realizes what has happened. The investors nodded, approving of my approach. None of them knew the full backstory of our relationship with Hubert, but Frank let them know that I had personal motives for this deal. What about his future in the company? Daniel Brooks asked. We've stipulated a 3-month transition period, but then what? Given his incompetence, I would recommend finding a new CEO, I wondered. Revenge was sweet, but business is business. We had invested heavily in this company and wanted to see it succeed. Let's see how he performs in these 3 months, I replied. If he can work under our guidance, follow the strategy we define, maybe he should be given a chance. If not, we'll look for a replacement. That's a reasonable approach, Frank agreed. After all, our goal is not to destroy the company, but to save it and make it profitable. When I returned home after the meeting, I found Hubert in the living room with a glass of whiskey. He looked unusually pensive. "Good evening, Aldrich," he greeted me with unexpected politeness. "How was your day?" "Not bad," I replied, surprised by his tone. "And you?" "Interesting." He took a sip of whiskey. "There's an important board meeting tomorrow. We'll meet the new shareholders of the company." "That's how it is," I tried to speak neutrally. "It sounds important." Hubert nodded, unaware that I knew a lot more about the deal than he realized. "You know, Aldrich," he said abruptly, "I may have been a little too harsh with you lately. Work, stress. But things are going to get better now. I have new opportunities, new perspectives." I could hardly contain a chuckle. If only he knew what prospects awaited him tomorrow. "Good for you, Hubert," I said sincerely. And it was true. I was glad to be able to teach him a lesson in respect at last. That night I couldn't sleep for a long time. My thoughts revolved around the day ahead, around the entire journey that had brought me to this moment, from humiliation to victory, from powerlessness to control. But there was also sadness that my own daughter had become a stranger, that she had chosen her husband's side over her father's. Perhaps tomorrow would also be a turning point in my relationship with Viola. In the morning I dressed especially carefully, the suit I wore only for important meetings, a fresh shirt, polished shoes. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw not the gutless old man I had felt a few weeks ago, but a man with dignity and strength. A man who would not let anyone else throw a dirty rag in his face. I went down to breakfast where Hubert was already finishing his coffee, getting ready for the very board meeting that would change his life. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his hair carefully styled, but there was tension in his eyes. He didn't yet know what was in store for him, but he might have sensed something. "Have a good day, Hubert," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "I hope the meeting goes well." He gave me a strange look, as if surprised by my friendly tone, but nodded and left the kitchen. A minute later I heard the front door slam, then the engine of his car start. I waited 15 minutes to make sure he wasn't coming back for something he'd forgotten. Then I left the house myself. Frank was supposed to pick me up at the street corner so Viola wouldn't accidentally see us together from the window. Frank's car, a black Mercedes with tinted windows, was already waiting for me. I sat in the front seat, feeling the adrenaline rush through my veins. "Ready for the big exit?" Frank asked with a smile. "More than ever," I answered, looking ahead at the road that led to the Tinker construction office, where not just revenge was waiting for me, but justice, restoration of my dignity. The Tinker construction office was in a 3-story brick building in the business district of Brunswick. It was nothing special, a standard 80s commercial building with large windows and a minimalist facade. The inside was just as impersonal: gray carpeting, white walls with a few construction project posters, boring office furniture. It didn't look like a company that had been around for over 30 years and once had a solid reputation in the construction industry. Frank parked his Mercedes in the parking lot in front of the building. Hubert's car, a black SUV, was already parked there. I felt my pulse quicken. "He's already here," I said, nodding at my brother-in-law's car. "Great." Frank looked at his watch. "We have 20 minutes before the meeting starts. The other investors should be here any minute." We got out of the car and headed toward the entrance. I walked slowly, trying to look confident, even though I was trembling with excitement inside. I'd imagined many times over the past few days how I'd enter the conference room, how I'd see Hubert's face when he realized what had happened. But reality is always different from fantasy. We were greeted in the lobby by a young receptionist who smiled politely at Frankie had been here before during the negotiations. "Mr. Abbott, hello. The meeting is in the conference room on the second floor. Mr. Tinker's waiting." "Thank you, Emily." Frank nodded. "And this is Mr. Poundstone, one of the new shareholders of the company." The girl gave me a polite but slightly surprised look. She probably didn't expect to see an elderly man among the investors. Or maybe she noticed my resemblance to Viola, who sometimes came to her husband's office. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Poundstone," she said with a professional smile. "Let me show you out." We went up to the second floor. On the way, we met several other investors from our group, all in expensive suits with leather briefcases, exuding the confidence of people accustomed to business negotiations. They greeted me with nods and handshakes as if I were an equal. The conference room was a large room with a long, dark wood table and leather chairs. On the walls hung pictures of completed Tinker construction projects, office buildings, apartment complexes, shopping centers. As a builder, it was obvious to me that most of these projects had been built under Tinker Sr. before Hubert took over the company. Hubert was standing at the window talking to 2 male board members. He looked tense, but tried to keep a confident demeanor. When he heard the door open, he turned around and his gaze slid over the entrance. When he saw Frank, he nodded. They'd already met in the negotiations. Then his gaze shifted to me, and for a moment there was a look of bewilderment in his eyes. "Aldrich?" His voice sounded confused. "What are you doing here?" Before I could answer, Frank stepped forward. "Mr. Tinker, let me introduce you to one of Brunswick Ventures' key investors, the new largest shareholder in your company, Mr. Aldrich Poundstone." Silence hung in the room. Hubert looked at me as if he had seen a ghost. His face slowly changed from bewilderment to realization, then shock, and finally horror. It's impossible," he said. You can't be an investor who bought a controlling interest in your company?" I finished the sentence for him, feeling strangely calm. "I very much can be, Hubert, and I already am." Hubert looked from me to Frank, then to the other investors as if looking for a rebuttal, a hint that this was a joke, but all the faces remained serious. "This is absurd," his voice sounded hoarse. "You don't have that kind of money. You're a pensioner, "A man who has worked and saved all his life," I replied calmly. "I also have friends who believe in my experience and business acumen. We formed an investment consortium specifically to buy your company, Hubert." One of the board members, an older man with gray hair, cleared his throat. "I think we should start the meeting, gentlemen," he said, pointing to his watch. "We have a full agenda." We settled around the table. I took a seat across from Hubert, who still looked shaken. His hands trembled slightly as he opened a folder of documents. The chairman of the board, the same gray-haired man, began the meeting with the formalities of welcoming us, approving the agenda and introducing the new shareholders. Hubert sat on pins and needles, casting me glances of confusion, anger, and fear. Then the discussion of the company's financial situation began. The numbers were disappointing. Debts, missed deadlines on projects, disgruntled clients, lawsuits from contractors. Hubert tried to explain the situation with temporary difficulties and unfavorable market conditions, but his arguments sounded unconvincing. "Mr. Tinker," I intervened when he finished his explanation, "let's call things by their proper names. The company is on the verge of bankruptcy, not because of market conditions, but because of incompetent management. You took on projects you couldn't pull off, hired cheap contractors, saved money on materials, promised unrealistic deadlines to customers. The result is consistent." Hubert turned black. "You have no right to say that. You don't understand anything about the modern construction business. You're just an old man who has worked in construction for 40 years, I interrupted him calmly. Who managed the construction of half the buildings in downtown Brunswick? Who knows the industry inside out, not from business school textbooks?" The board members and other investors watched our verbal altercation intently. I felt their support. They already knew about my experience and reputation in the construction industry. "I have a business school degree," Hubert parried, trying to maintain his dignity. "I studied modern management, marketing, finance, but not construction," I said. "Not how to pour foundations, how to calculate loads, how to assess the quality of materials, not what makes a construction company successful." Hubert opened his mouth to object, but the chairman interrupted us. "Gentlemen, let's get back to the agenda. We are not here to argue, but to discuss the future of the company." I nodded, recognizing his point. Revenge was sweet, but business is business. We had invested heavily in this company and wanted to see it succeed. Frank presented our plan to get the company out of the crisis, restructuring debt, focusing on completing current projects instead of chasing new ones, returning to the high-quality standards Tinker Construction had once been known for. "What about the company's leadership?" one of the board members asked, looking at Hubert and me. "Under the terms of the contract, Mr. Tinker will remain CEO for another 3 months, a transition period," Frank replied. "Then the board would decide whether to extend his term or appoint a new CEO." Hubert looked as if he had been slapped in the face. He had clearly not expected his position in the company his father had founded to be jeopardized. "You can't just take me out," he said hoarsely. "I'm Tinker. This is my company." "Used to be yours," I corrected gently. "Now we have controlling interest, and the board of directors will make decisions based on the interests of the company, not your name." The meeting lasted another hour. We discussed concrete steps to stabilize the financial situation, interaction with creditors, strategy of work with clients and contractors. Hubert hardly participated in the discussion. He sat there, immersed in his own thoughts, occasionally throwing hateful and bewildered glances at me. When the meeting was over and most of the participants had left the room, Hubert approached me. His face was pale but determined. "Why did you do it?" he asked quietly. "Was it to get back at me? Because of that stupid rag story?" I looked him straight in the eye. "Not just because of the rag, Hubert. Because of all the days you treated me like a servant in my own house. The way you talked about me to Viola like I was nothing. Because of your arrogance and contempt. But most of all, because I watched you destroy the company your father spent decades building. A company that deserves a better leader. You ruined my life," he hissed. "Do you understand that?" "No, Hubert," I shook my head. "I saved your company from bankruptcy, gave you a chance to right your wrongs, And I taught you a lesson you should have learned a long time ago. Treat people with respect, no matter what their age or position. You never know who's going to turn out to be your savior or your boss." Hubert clenched his fists but held back. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he realized that he couldn't always get what he wanted simply because he thought he was superior to others. "What are you going to do next?" he asked tensely. "Are you going to fire me? Kick me out of the house?" I wondered. Revenge was sweet, but that wasn't my ultimate goal. "That's up to you, Hubert," I answered. "The next 3 months will show whether you are capable of learning and changing, whether you can work for the good of the company and not just for your own ego. If so, you may have a future at Tinker Construction. If not, we'll find someone more suitable." "And what about the house?" "The house is mine, and it will stay mine," I said firmly. "But I'm not going to throw you and Viola out on the street. You can live there until you find your own place. On one condition: respect, to me and to my house." Hubert stared at me in silence, digesting what I had heard. Finally, he nodded, not agreeing but acknowledging the new reality. "Does Viola know?" he asked. "No," I answered. "But she would find out tonight." I left the conference room, leaving Hubert alone with his thoughts. Frank was waiting for me in the hallway. "How'd it go?" he asked with a smile. "Did you get satisfaction?" "More than I expected," I admitted. "But that's just the beginning. Now we really have to save the company." "With your experience and our resources, we can do it," Frank said confidently. "What about Hubert?" "We'll give him a chance," I said. "If he can put his ego aside and work for the good of the company, let him stay. If not, we'll find a replacement." On the way home, I thought about my upcoming conversation with Viola. How would she react? Would she take her husband's side, as she had done before, or would she finally see the situation through my eyes? I didn't know, but I was prepared for either outcome. Viola got home from work around 6 in the evening. Hubert hadn't arrived yet. Apparently he was hesitant to come home and face me and her after what had happened. I was waiting for my daughter in the living room, sitting in my old armchair with a cup of tea. "Daddy?" She looked at me in surprise. "You are not in the kitchen." "No, Viola," I replied calmly. "I didn't cook dinner tonight. We need to talk." She frowned, sensing the seriousness of the moment. She took off her coat, put her bag aside, and sat down on the sofa opposite me. "What's wrong? Where's Hubert?" "Still at the office, I suppose. Or maybe at the bar," I shrugged. "He'd had a rough day." "Why?" There was concern in Viola's voice. "Because he found out today that I've become the largest shareholder in his company," I answered simply. "In fact, his boss." Viola looked at me, not understanding. "What are you talking about, Daddy? Is this some kind of joke?" "No, daughter, it's not a joke." I set the cup aside and stepped forward. I, along with a group of investors, acquired a controlling interest in Tinker Construction. The deal was closed a few days ago. Today was the first board meeting with the new shareholders, where Hubert found out who was his new boss. Viola turned pale. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, like a fish thrown on the shore. "But how? Where did you get that kind of money? And why?" "The money from selling our share of the family business after Mom died," I explained, "plus a loan against the house, plus investments from my partners." "Why?" I looked her straight in the eye. "After your husband threw a rag in my face and called me a servant. After you took his side instead of mine. After all those days when you treated me like a domestic servant in my own home." Viola lowered her eyes. There was embarrassment and shame on her face. "Papa, we didn't mean—" "Don't, Viola," I stopped her. "You both knew exactly what you were doing. You saw me as an old man who could do nothing but mop floors and cook breakfast. But I set out to prove you wrong." "And now what?" she asked quietly. "Will you throw us out of the house? Are you going to fire Hubert?" "No," I shook my head. "The house is mine, and it will stay mine. but you can live here until you find your own place, as long as it's respectful. As for Hubert's job, that will depend on him. If he can put his ego aside and work for the company his father founded, he stays. If not, we'll find a replacement. Viola sat in silence, digesting what I'd heard. I could see the emotions changing in her eyes: disbelief, shock, understanding, and, finally, something like respect. "I underestimated you, Dad," she finally said. "We both did." "Yes, you did," I agreed. "And that was your mistake. Never judge a person by their age or their appearance, especially if that person is your father who has worked his whole life to give you a decent future." At that moment, we heard the sound of the front door opening. Hubert had come home. He looked exhausted and depressed when he entered the living room and saw us. "Have you told her yet?" he asked me tiredly. "Yes," I nodded. "Viola knows about the deal and my new status in your company." Hubert looked at his wife as if seeking support or sympathy. Viola was silent, and in her eyes he found nothing but confusion. "I'll go upstairs," he said after a pause. "I need to think." When he had gone, Viola turned to me. "What happens next, Papa?" "Life, Viola," I answered simply. "A life where everyone gets what they deserve. A life where respect is earned, not demanded. Where age is not a judgment and experience is not a burden." She nodded, and in that nod I saw understanding. Not forgiveness, not on my part or hers, but recognition of a new reality. A reality in which I was no longer an unwilling shadow in my own home, and she was no longer a little girl who could offend her father and expect unconditional forgiveness. In the days and weeks that followed, much changed. Hubert no longer gave me orders, no longer demanded that I make breakfast or iron my shirts. He was distant but polite, like a man who still couldn't quite believe what had happened. Viola became more attentive and caring. She began to cook for herself, to clean up after herself, to ask my opinion on various matters, not out of fear or favor, but out of newfound respect. I regularly visited the Tinker construction office, attended board meetings, and met with clients and contractors. My experience and reputation in the construction industry helped restore confidence in the company. Gradually, the financial situation stabilized, and some troubled projects were completed with minimal losses. Hubert, to his credit, worked hard. He worked late into the night, followed the advice of the board, and learned to listen to the opinions of experienced employees. Perhaps, for the first time in his life, he realized that he wasn't always the smartest person in the room. We didn't become friends or even close family. A wall of past hurts and humiliations remained between us, but we learned to coexist, as business partners, as people bound by common interests and family ties, and I regained my self-respect and my independence. I no longer felt like a useless old man, a burden to those around me. I was Aldrich Poundstone again, the man who had built half the buildings in Brunswick, who had lived a decent life and earned respect. And it all started with a dirty rag thrown in my face. Who would have thought that humiliation could be the beginning of rebirth? That at 72, life could offer a fresh start, new possibilities, new meaning. As I once told Hubert, you never know who will turn out to be your savior or your boss. And it is never too late to remind those who have forgotten simple human respect.